So let me give you a little background. I'm the Bennett Chair of Prevention Research here at Penn State and the Director of the Prevention Research Center. And my faculty position is in human development and family studies, and I'm trained as a developmental psychopathologist, a person who's interested in normal development and abnormal development and how we can understand both of those together and learn from both of those. My interest in psychology came late. And as an undergraduate, I had really almost no interest in it until I met a professor named Mary Ainsworth who studied attachment in babies. And I became fascinated with the issue of how personality develops. And as a result, I went to graduate school, and at graduate school, I began to become interested in attachments, of course, in young children. How do we talk about attachments? How do we identify attachments that are healthy or maybe not so healthy? As a result of that, I got interested in being a clinician, and during that work, I began to see children who were deaf, that had no, in most cases, very, very little speech and very little ability to hear. And at that point, it was in the early 70s, there was a great deal of restriction on deaf children in that they were only taught to speak. But research had just been developing the last few years about deaf children of deaf parents. They only represent about 6%, 5 or 6% of all deaf children, because most genetic deafness is either not genetic or it's recessive rather than dominant. So deaf children are born into the strange situation of almost never having deaf parents. But there is a small group of deaf parents that have deaf children, and when you look at their development, what you find is they develop more effectively, both social-emotionally and academically. It appears the reason is because they get early sign language and an early natural language from their parents. So I became interested in the new movement that was happening in the 70s, which was allowing deaf children now to begin to have sign language. The first early intervention programs in America had just really begun that were allowing, when a baby was diagnosed as deaf or a 3-year-old was diagnosed as deaf, to teach the parents and the child sign language as a more natural language. And so I was very interested in if the attachments between deaf children that had early sign language and deaf children that did not would be different. And that's how my interest in this issue of emotional development and language began. And what I showed in the 1970s was that deaf children that had sign language, all having hearing parents, but deaf children that had sign language early, we called it then total communication, turned out to have more secure attachments with their parents, and their parents were less stressed, and their development was proceeding more effectively. Now, things have changed a lot since then. We have cochlear implants and lots of other things going on in deafness. But I became interested then in following deaf children over time, preschoolers. And as I followed them into the school age, and I looked at young deaf adults, what I found is they had large social-emotional deficiencies. Which were not caused by deafness itself. It wasn't the hearing loss that was causing the problem. It wasn't a processing problem. It was the environments that they were growing up in. They had impoverished language for emotions. They, because they were deaf, couldn't overhear things, so they had much lower rates of incidental learning about how life goes. And so I became interested in developing preventive interventions around building the social-emotional development of children, and specifically deaf children. And so in 1980, we began with the first version of the PATHS curriculum. It stands for Promoting Alternative Thinking Strategies. And now it's one of the blueprints for violence prevention in America and used many places. But at that point, we were only interested in deaf children, and we developed a version of this in which we focused a lot on language and making language visible. So there are many things that we did in that early work for deaf children that turns out work very well for hearing children, that making language more visible, having people talk out loud to themselves, having visual cues of words, different places, etc., was very effective in cueing them into the use of language, especially the language of emotions, and building in the sense that language can be used as a model, as a technique for reflection. Okay, what John Dewey talked about in the 1890s, Lev Vygotsky talked about as the second signal system, but it's this ability to have language creating a distance between your impulse to act and the action itself. So I became interested in how language was related to social-emotional development, and over time we've done many projects on this. We've done randomized trials with hearing children, deaf children, special needs children, children that are typically developing, all showing that when you develop high-quality social-emotional curriculum that can be used by teachers in the classrooms, you train teachers well, that you can develop improved social-emotional competence in children, as well as reducing problems, as reducing aggressive behavior, reducing depressive symptoms. And from the beginning, I've been interested in the neural science correlates of these issues. That is, we believe that what we're affecting when we teach children social emotional skills is the connections between the emotion centers of the brain and the frontal lobe. And as a result, I've written extensively about the neuroscience issues in the field of prevention, and at the same time, I've only measured them very modestly at best. But we have been able to show, for example, that children who improve more in their behavior when they are randomized to get this PATHS curriculum are children who also are showing improvements in their executive functions and their ability to show more effective inhibitory control and planning. And I believe that that's partly the result of the fact that they are learning to talk to themselves as they plan action. That the ability to use language to regulate behavior is probably one of the primary criteria of maturity, at least in our Western culture.
That's great.
Yeah.
Complexly, but wonderful. It ties it all together.
Well, it is complex.
Right.
Yeah.
We're interested in what we call self-talk story too, right? How it is that children learn to talk to themselves.
Right.
And so what I hear you drawing out is how that's enabled by a certain level or quality of language that the child has, and to the extent that they have an impoverished internal vocabulary or communication system, ability to communicate with themselves and others, that constrains the range, that has an impact on their social and emotional development. Right? Can
That's
you
right.
talk to that mechanism a little bit more, flesh that out?
We don't.
I'm reminded of one of our interviewees, Terrence Deacon, and if you read his work, the coevolution of language in the brain. Mm-hmm. Making examples of how it is that language has become so powerfully important to us as an organism, mm-hmm. that children born literally with less than a whole brain that will develop a pathway through that brain to language
Yeah,
if
right.
it's possible.
Yeah,
it's got that kind of force.
Yeah.
And I would imagine it has an associated incredibly important emotional meaning to it developmentally. And that's kind of this base that has these emotional consequences later if it's not developing right. So if we could zero in on that somewhere, that would be great.
Well, we can think developmentally about the relationship between communication and emotion. As when you think about a baby, babies can't lie. That's one of the wonderful things. Freud once said that the only relationship it's possible to ever have in your life that isn't ambivalent is with a baby, because babies are completely present with you all the time, and they tell you exactly how they feel every moment. In a momentary fashion, their emotions are changing, they're kicking their feet, they're moving their bodies, they're changing their facial expressions. There's no screen where a baby doesn't think, well, I think I should wait 5 minutes before I tell my mother I'm angry, or I'm upset, or I'm scared. They just literally show all their emotions as they act. Action and emotion are one phenomena for a baby. So as children begin to develop representational skills, they now get language, and so now they have two forms of communication. They have this paralinguistic emotional communication in their bodies and their faces, and now they have talk. They have language, symbolic representation. But while they do in the first, by 18 months, they have their first 50 words, and then language develops dramatically quickly after that. Language is only serving one function at that point, and that function is to communicate to other people. Language is not yet truly serving the function of self-communication. And that awaits the next phase, I think, of development, which we think is somewhere between 3 and 4 years of age. It varies by child, so there's big individual differences. But this is what Vygotsky called the second signal system, or John Dewey talked about the role of talk. And the issue here is now talk is not just to tell other people things, it's to tell yourself things. And you see this in working with parents and being a parent, is that trying to talk down a 2 or 3 year 2-year-old that's having a temper tantrum doesn't work. As much as we'd like to use inductive discipline and talk to them, when a 2-year-old is very upset, you really have to hold them or distract them, take them away from the situation. You can't really talk them out of their emotion. In fact, it's very hard to do that with adults many times, but it's not possible with 2-year-olds, and that's because when they're upset and their emotions are coursing through their brain, their cognitive capacity to listen to language or to talk to themselves about what's happening is just not present. Somewhere between age 3 and 4, this magic change begins to occur, in which children now begin to use language to represent things to themselves as they're actually happening. And a perfect example of this is in our research. We often use what's called the strain situation, which is a laboratory situation in which the mother and the child are separated. And the mother plays with the child, and then she leaves the room. And the child is in the room by themselves, and it's often upsetting to them. Their heart rates are going up. Some are concerned where their mother is, even though they know she's coming back. And some of them will begin to get a little weepy. But oftentimes they'll look in the one-way mirrors we're using for filming, and then they'll say to themselves something like, "My mommy's coming back." Or they'll start to sing to themselves. This is a play therapist. This is a fundamental aspect of play therapy, as children can now begin to play representationally to manage their emotions. Self-soothe, exactly. And this is the culmination of a major change in development, which is the ability to self-talk, which we think is related to now having the frontal lobes, the language centers of the brain, and our frontal lobes now beginning to take their first actions to begin to regulate affect, so that when people get very upset, they can start to try to talk themselves down. And this is fundamentally what we began to work on in the PATHS curriculum with 4 and 5-year-olds. And now we do it with 3 to 4-year-olds, is to teach them how to stop themselves, to stop and calm down when they begin to become upset. And we do that by having them do both motor activities. We call it doing turtle, or for deaf children, doing turtle, or you're using the sign for turtle as part of you're using language and they motor act together. But the idea is to do turtle, which is partly to put your hands like this, where there's a motor activity that will not get you in trouble. The second thing is to take a deep breath through your nose, which is bringing down the heart rate. And the third thing is we tell children to tell themselves inside to stop, and then to ask themselves, how are they feeling? So we're using motor activity, we're using heart vagal regulation, and we're using talk all together to help children move to that stage in which, for the first time, rather than rolling on the floor when they're upset, they'll stamp their foot and say, "I'm angry. I'm really angry." And that, by saying that, by using language, it can oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes substitute for that rolling around on the floor and having the tantrum, right? So this is the change. This is the change we're interested in early childhood. You know the book by Robert Fulghum, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And that's very similar to the psychoanalytic ideas like Freud's, that personality is formed by around age 4 or 5. And that's because it's around that age of 4 to 5 that people gain the ability to have self-control, to monitor their behavior, to begin to use a language of emotions, to understand that other people have different feelings, thoughts, and perspectives than they do, and that they need to coordinate those two. And that's the major sea change of development.
Things that's remarkable, that's very interesting to me and remarkable about this is that what you're describing seems to be a recapitulation of the whole process of what made us human, in the sense that we went from some kind of a instrumental use of language as an external thing, mm-hmm. to this verbal self-reflexivity, this I am, from which to have the skills and capabilities to interrupt and modulate ourselves in some way that wasn't just automatic runaway.
That's right. I think you're right. This verbal self-reflexivity, it does recapitulate evolutionary processes, I believe, because it's likely that language was first used for communication with others rather than for self-regulation. And now we've moved to a civilization, to a culture in which the self is paramount and self-regulation is paramount. And so it's even more necessary now. Even in the past 20 or 30 years, we see a major change in modern Western cultures compared to less technological cultures in the need for the self to manage things. We live in a very complex society. So, for example, even when I was a child, I didn't have to worry about getting in trouble. When I was a child, getting in trouble was something that would happen as soon as I'd misbehaved, because there were so many connections between my father and my mother, and my teachers, my neighborhood, the business people in our neighborhood, that as soon as something happened, they'd find out right away. So I didn't have to worry so much about my own self-regulation, because I knew I was also being regulated by the people around me. And that's how most all communities that humans have developed in work. That is, until very recently, children were known to everyone, adults were known to everyone in the community, and if someone had a deficiency in this behavior or that behavior, they didn't have very good self-control, or they tend to be more impulsive, or they tended to be more sadder more of the time, people were watching them all the time and helping them to regulate themselves. In our very modern technological culture, we now have to manage ourselves probably more than we are evolutionary constrained to do. We're a culture of community, but we primarily live now in cultures of self. And I think this is very problematic, because we're asking children at younger ages, and adults even, to do things that probably are very difficult for most of us to do the way we're constructed.
And our wiring, as it's evolved, as it's developed, it didn't set us up to do this. This is pretty much learned, right?
This is pretty much learned, I believe. Now, that's not to say that even thousands of years, we didn't have the ability to have self-control. In fact, we know from our religious traditions that the ability to have self-control, to transcend normal consciousness, is always present in the human condition. But the ability for everyone, for people of all levels of ability, to be able to manage themselves in ways that they can be successful and optimize their development, it's very complicated in our culture.
Well, the distinction being that in the past, we lived in an enmeshment with a community or a tribe or a group that was giving us a more coherent feedback to what it is that we were doing. And now we live in a more fragmentary relationship with lots of different people, and we don't have the same degree of reflection back from people that's informing how we develop self-control.
That's right.
In the way that you were describing.
That's right. So we placed a lot more responsibility on the self, and at earlier and earlier ages. We see this happening even in the last I would say the last 20 to 30 years, as children are going to school earlier, they're leaving the family culture in that sense earlier on in life, and I think it's part of what we often call the American question, and it's how early we can do things. And I think given the individualistic nature of our culture, much of which we don't even realize because it's unconscious to us, we have placed more and more stress on the self's ability to regulate at earlier and earlier ages. And in fact, when we help children to regulate at earlier ages, they're pretty good at it. But we should understand this is not the normal context of the development of our species, or even the normal context of the development in most cultures of the world right now.
Right. And as you point out, that there's something about the fact that when we do want to help children develop earlier, better self-regulation, at least it is something that they can, they can feel in the reflection of other people. It isn't as abstract or artificial as some of the other challenges we're heaping on them at same ages. Yeah?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, all cultures have encoded ways to help children develop self-control, and there are lots of games. So we have games in American culture, probably the basically European tradition, like Mother May I, musical chairs, red light, green light. I remember when I was a child, I would play red light, green light with my grandmother until it got dark at night, where I'd try to slink across the yard before she'd turn her head. And I remember in kindergarten we would play musical chairs. All the chairs would be set up in the middle of the room, and we'd all run around the chairs, and the music would stop. We all had to get to a chair, and we'd laugh. It was lots of fun, but it was a self-control training game. And all cultures have these mechanisms. There are naturalistic cultural games that train these skills. If we had to wait for education to train those skills, it'd probably be much more difficult. But there are lots of games that children play all the time that are games that are about self-control. It's a fun skill to learn. It's a skill that gives children a sense of competence. And what we find is when we teach kids these skills in the past curriculum or other kinds of social emotional curriculums, the children get a great sense of confidence from the ability to feel. They feel more mature. They feel more in control of themselves, and that's a very powerful, positive feeling.
Right. One of the things I got when you were describing paths was that you're in addition to having these different dimensions that's bringing them in, they're also disentraining the kind of automatic propulsion that would have happened from the triggering of whatever was going on. Right?
That's right.
And that these games provide an analogous mechanism of turn taking, of bumping up against failure or frustration or something not going right, but learning to deal with that without necessarily going off the end, huh?
That's right. That's right. So one of the goals of teaching children to be more social emotionally competent is not making sure that they're always happy. Or that everybody feels good. The point is that the most important thing in our development from a social emotional standpoint is to learn how to put into words what feelings we have, ourselves and others, because when those feelings can be put into words, they can be known and they can be managed. So, for example, there are many emotions that are confusing to us, even as adults at times. So, for example, it's often much more comfortable to feel angry than it is other emotions, because anger is an emotion that, for biological reasons, makes us strike out. Our heart rate goes up, we tense, we want to act out. Anger makes you want to punch, right, to push away. And that's a very comfortable emotion for many people. It's much easier to tell someone you're angry often than to say you're quite disappointed. It's often the case that we misidentify anger. So, for example, we'll often see people who are feeling jealous, and we'll misperceive them as feeling angry. Now, if you feel jealous, but people think you feel angry, they're going to treat you much differently. And if you understand what jealousy is as a child, and you can identify when you're feeling jealous, and you can tell someone you're feeling jealous of them, rather than angry at them, they're going to treat you very much differently. Should we take a break?
You see out there?
Oh, it stopped. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I had both things.
Oh.
Is it making too much noise? Is it trying to tow the car away?
Even in adulthood, of course, we have the problem of misidentifying feelings all the time. It's one of the major issues in adult relationships. But perfect example is the issue of feeling shy versus conceited. We'll often see people that are just for personality reasons quite shy. They don't strike up conversations, and oftentimes other people will perceive them as being conceited, or they'll attribute to them some other emotion that's radically different than shyness. And as a result, treat them much differently. So the ability to both recognize and put into words emotions has a power that's quite large. We did a study of about 300 second, third, and fourth graders in which we interviewed them about emotions. We asked them to talk about different emotions. We looked at their developmental understanding of emotions. And we then looked at their level of behavior problems. We matched them all in reading achievement and IQ. And then we looked at kids that had high, medium, and low behavior problems, as reported by teachers in their classrooms. And what we found was, even when we equated them for reading ability and for IQ, the children that had more behavior problems were less able to talk about emotions. Okay. Now, the children that are having the behavior problems are the ones that show their emotions much more often. They're the ones that are often more angry, more jealous, more sad, more upset. So the ability to feel a lot of emotions is not the same thing as the ability to communicate about them, to talk about them or reflect on them.
To be able to modulate them more finely because of your ability to reflect on and communicate them.
That's right. So self-reflectivity, while it can be overblown as a concept, and neuroses are often the result of being overly self-reflective and a bit obsessive, there's clearly a developmental skill here that many children learn naturally, but many don't, as we know by the rates of behavior problems in our culture and addiction problems. And that's the ability to know how you feel, to be able to plan ahead so you can manage your feelings effectively.
And plan ahead is also constructed out of this language system in a way, yeah?
That's right. Yeah.
We don't, the differences between the baby and whether they're lying, you can also say the baby lives in a relatively absolute now.
That's right. Right. And so in the same way, I think I mentioned earlier that one of the ways that we've shown the effects of social emotional learning, for example, in our case, the PATHS curriculum, on children's teacher-rated externalizing behavior and internalizing problems. So the children who are randomized to get the classroom that has the PATHS curriculum compared to those that don't, over time, a year, 2 years later, reported by a different teacher that didn't use the curriculum, they're reported to have lower behavior problems and less withdrawal, depression, and anxiety. And we've been able to show now that this is mediated by their changes in their planning abilities. So, for example, even though we've never taught them anything in the PATHS curriculum about planning, planning in a cognitive situation,
an explicit mechanical way, but
right?
Nonetheless, it's implicit in.
Right. We find significant effects on the Maze's task of the Wechsler Intelligence Scale, which is a task that's a time task, so there's some anxiety involved, and there's emotion involved in everything, but especially in time tasks. And they have to represent, with blocks, pictures that they have to move blocks to make them look exactly like blocks on a picture. And this ability, of course, often is mediated by the ability to talk to yourself, to plan ahead. So you're looking at this block, you're looking at the picture, and you're saying to themselves, well, I think I need to rotate it this way, or it doesn't quite look right. And that self-regulative talk is part of the success in doing the task. What we show is that children that have a better social emotional development, especially as a result of intervention, do significantly better on this task, even though it's never been trained. And that ability to do better on this task is what explains the effects on children's anxiety and depression.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. I'd like to step back to this critical developmental window that this is happening in. This is important because, as the country races to universal pre-K and wants to reach down in some generalization that looks like it's 4 years old or so, in some respects, it's an important step for the system as a whole to recognize. On another level, the trajectories that we're talking about are still forming in really important ways long before we can reach them institutionally. I draw that out in terms of both what you said about early language development, the kind of vocabulary explosion, and its relationship to the beginning of turning inward to self-reflexivity, and that time window. Let's expand that a bit developmentally when that's happening.
Well, these changes in both the rapid expansion of language and the ability to take other people's points of view, to begin to have self-control, to begin to what we call social problem solving, to recognize that you have a problem and that rather than just habitually respond to it, that you can actually think, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. These all happen around the ages of 3.5 to 5. We see these rapid changes in development, which we believe are related to what knowledge we do have now about changes in the neural connections in the brain, the large growth of connections between the frontal lobe and the other aspects of the brain, both the language centers and the emotion centers of the brain. And that's why the frontal lobe is called the executive function, because it is the executive that takes together emotion, reasoning, language aspects, and it makes decisions based on all those characteristics, and then sends it to the motor neurons for action. So this dramatic change that begins between 3.5 and 5 in frontal lobe development is something that's going to slowly develop now across time. There was a belief till recently that the frontal lobe may be matured by ages 12 or 13, but it's now clear that it's the last maturing part of the brain. It won't mature until the 20s, we believe, and therefore it's the part of the brain that's most affected by experience. It's the least genetically determined part of our self, if you will, and therefore the most likely to be modified by what parents do, what teachers do, peer relations, the nature of our communities, etc., are all shaping the frontal lobe's development.
So in that sense, it's the more the center of the learning in a way, in that it's regulating how it is that we're present and interacting with things that we're encountering, but it's not as driven by our neurobiology as by our experiences.
That's right. So the frontal lobe really, truly is the center of experience, in the sense that it's taking all experience in, it's making decisions about how to react to it. And that's what makes us more and more able, it's what makes a 7-year-old able to sit in the classroom in spite of the fact that they may be bored or angry. What allows us to sit in a lecture hall all day and listen to speakers, in spite of the fact that we may be fantasizing about being on the beach. A 2-year-old doesn't do that. A 2-year-old gets up out of the chair and walks away. But this frontal lobe ability allows us to have more and more ability to manage ourselves, to know how we feel at the same time, to manage our behavior to meet the needs of a current task. And that's why we don't have desks in kindergartens and in preschools, and we shouldn't have them, because children are not ready to sit at desks. That's not the developmental spot at which they are at. It doesn't meet the needs of their fundamental activity of their age. 7-year-olds most 7-year-olds can sit at a desk for reasonably long periods of time, because their frontal lobe is developed enough now that they are able to plan ahead enough to realize that they can get something done, and in spite of the fact they want to go out to the playground and play, they can still maintain attention for a relatively long period of time. 3-year-old doesn't do that.
Is there a correspondence between the explosion of language and the 3.5 to 5-year-old takeoff window that you're describing?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I don't know that there's explicit research showing that there's a relationship between the explosion in language and these changes in the frontal lobe, but it's very likely that that's the case.
I would think that some of your work on deaf and the differences you experienced there would shed some light on that.
Well, the fact that deaf children are behind in many of these social emotional tasks is probably, we can ascribe it probably to language, because they're no different in their other cognitive abilities. As deaf children fundamentally are normal in every way, except they can't hear, and as a result of not hearing, they have a lower, they have less language, less vocabulary, less syntax, etc. So we can't unquestionably attribute the immaturity, social emotional immaturity, to the absence of language. It's probably very likely, and that there's pretty good data to show that language feeds these frontal activities.
Right.
The more language we have, the better.
Not thinking of language as a phenomena, but in this case as the mediator of this conversation that's going on inside.
That's right.
It builds to this level of having reflection and control and regulation and so forth. It's building the frontal.
That's right. Yeah, and it's likely that's the case. There is some controversy about this. That some of the Piagetians believe that symbols can do the same things without language. But it's Hans Firth, for example, was a cognitive psychologist who studied deaf children. He believed that deaf children could do many of the things that Piaget talked about as concrete operations, independent of the fact that they didn't have language. But the more we study this, the more we realize that the language is really an essential component here. And very interesting research on theory of mind, for example, which is what we used to call perspective taking in the 70s, the ability to take another person's point of view or understand that there are different minds have different theories of action, clearly is at least partly mediated by the ability to talk and the explosion in language.
So then to the extent that what I want to do now is kind of come in from another angle and connect the Hart-Risley kind of work relative to language developmental trajectories. And in particular, one of the points that they make, which I thought was really important and that bears on our conversation today, is the differences in kind of talk, the business talk versus the open-ended, turn-taking, extensional conversations, and the affect qualities of those two, such that parents that are more taciturn are basically creating an environment where there's much greater relative percentage of negative emotional stuff going on, and how that's the language and then the kinds of language is affecting this trajectory, which feeds into where we just were.
That's right. Right. Well, there's no question that the amount of language input a child gets is critically important. And we know that, for example, low-income children get much less talk. They hear fewer words, and that dramatically affects their experience. This is one of the major and important roles of early childhood education in America now, is Head Start being a great example of this, is putting children in an environment in which they're exposed to lots of language. And not only just the amount of language, but the richness of it. That language is not just about getting people to do things, come here, come there, but it's about explaining experience. And the more that we use inductive language in which we explain experience, where we have children expressing themselves openly, the more likely they are to develop both better language skills, but to increase their cognitive abilities, because language and cognition in that sense can't be separated at this age.
One of the things that's been interesting relative to theory of mind work that I've seen, and Patricia Kuhl's work on development of children in relation to qualities of parent ease and so forth, has to do with talking about the learning / developmental growth power of language experience being connected to its affective meaning, in the sense that children can be in a room with a television set going and there's all kinds of language happening, but it doesn't have the same meaning for them. It's not as rich. They're not pulled into it. The connection isn't there, and so forth. It's not just language. It's language happening in the channel of importance at the human level.
Right.
So maybe we could speak to that.
Well, Piaget talked about emotion and cognition, and what he said about emotion and cognition is that there is no cognition without emotion. He called what he said basically is that all emotion, all action is driven by people's emotions, and so the extent that we're in situations that are emotionally warm, emotionally stimulating, we're likely to learn better. And so language is, when we embed language in context, is very important. We know that children, while they hear language on television, and it may build their vocabulary, it doesn't build their ability to express themselves. Expression is a result of a reciprocal relationship in which there's turn-taking and in which there's emotional warmth. And anyone knows this that works with children or even spends time with children, that the more they feel comfortable, especially when they're younger, the more they'll talk. And when they don't feel comfortable, they clam up. And so the ability to have a warm, reciprocal, secure relationship for children is critical to the whole opening of this flower of language. That language is contextual, just like everything else, and emotion drives both children's cognitive abilities and their language abilities.
So, I mean, for me, where this goes is we see this really powerful correspondence between the richness of language exposure, its affective charge, that the kind of language that's going on also has affective consequences in terms of changing the threshold of emotions that are happening. And it's setting up the stage for the reading trajectory, and it's setting up the stage for the kind of self-regulation that you were just talking about.
Yeah.
And all of this is happening and has established some inertia in trajectory by the time the children are 3. Okay.
Somewhere around there, I guess.
Okay.
I don't know, David.
Okay. What would you say as far as that goes? I mean,
I would say that the first 5 years are very important in life, but the next 5 years are just as important. And while we know a lot about how language, emotion, and cognition are forming, especially in this period of 3 to 6 years of age, and there's no question that it's a perfect time for intervention, as we know that we can help children to become both social emotionally more competent and cognitively more competent at that age period. That this is a continuing saga, and we know that children who receive good quality social emotional environments, for example, curriculums in schools, even all the way through adolescence, these curriculums are likely to have an impact on both their own self-reflectivity as well as their ability to manage themselves. So while early is important, we don't want to confuse early with what's necessary for development. There's often a sense in American psychology and American policy these days that if we just do something really good early, then we're finished. And what we mistake is the fact that early environments are good for children. They're important because of the brain maturation, but that for children to have a healthy adult, for children to be healthy adults that contribute well to society, both from a community standpoint, a tax-paying standpoint, a policy standpoint, it's important that we have environments that are healthy for them all the time. So taking poor children in America and giving them fantastic early childhood programs, but keeping them in neighborhoods in which the schools are poorly provisioned, teachers are poorly trained, curriculums are not up to date, neighborhoods are unsafe. Early childhood programs are not going to solve the problem of development in adolescence. We know development doesn't work that way. So while early is important, we don't want to mistake its importance for making it paramount.
Jack Shonkoff talking about the sensitive periods of development, neuroscience point of view, and others that we've talked to say, look, there's no question that that there's sufficient plasticity that we can affect the trajectories, along a long span that go far beyond. But in terms of the neurological ecology and efficiency, that if children haven't developed a sufficiently robust level of language processing in their 3 to 4 year old range, then their trajectory relative to what's necessary to break through the wall of literacy, for example, that's coming a year or so down the road, is off kilter to that task.
That's right.
And that puts them on a dangerous trajectory in general. It's not that we can't remediate it,
right,
but it's many times
especially
less
for language,
efficient neurologically and systemically in terms of cost.
Right. So when we want to think about the development of early reading processes, here's where it's very important. I would agree with you completely that having rich, warm, and say that again. Having rich, warm, and complex language environments and for young children are critical to help them set the stage for early reading processes. And there's no question that I want to say this clearly. Think about this a little bit.
I appreciate your...
You okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Rich and complex language environments in early childhood, there's no question they're essential for helping children set up the skills for now accomplishing the challenge of reading. And we know that that's also related to having warm environments. So warm, responsive parents and teachers that complexly talk to children, that give them a variety of language, are critical for early reading development.
The way that we're trying to zero in this space from, let's say, 3-year-old to fourth grade, is there's this developmental trajectory that we've been talking about in different ways. There's this incredibly confusing, unnaturally confusing code processing challenge, which has no precedent in our social, emotional, or cognitive, evolutionary, historical processes and so forth. And that in addition to having a certain level of language proficiency, meaning both vocabulary richness that's exercised phonemic awareness differentiation, but also speed of processing that has enough horsepower, so to speak, to assemble this virtual language experience and so forth and all of that. But here's where we connect again, is that they need a strength of self to stay in the couldn't be otherwise frustration without emotionally bailing out. That's coming in this earlier window, and that's less to do with the mechanics of reading skill and more to do with the kind of social, emotional self-regulation that you've been describing, and that these things hit together in the takeoff to reading.
Right. One of the really important things that comes together in early childhood in this 3 to 5 year period is not only children's ability to regulate their emotion and to begin to know how they feel and take others' points of view, but it's to maintain attention. And attention is what we often call a shuttlecock of emotion, in the sense that children who are able to maintain attention for longer periods of time are able to meet all kinds of challenges. Challenges in their peer relationships, ability to monitor what their parents are doing and to link to them, but also now to begin the challenges of the first aspects of formal education. And one of those, of course, is preparing for the reading challenge. Children who have have difficulties in maintaining attention, or often children also have difficulties regulating their emotions. And when that's the case, and they face the challenge of learning a complex task like reading, this is where their social emotional development impacts their ability to learn that process of reading. And here we're not talking primarily about the mechanics of reading, but an approach to a task that requires high cognitive and attentional demands. Okay.
I really am both trying to make sure that we talk about certain points, but I also want to stay wide open. I mean, I have a great respect for where you're coming from, and I want to make sure that anything in this space that you think is important to share gets shared.
Well, I think there's, when you think about the emotion, social emotional issues, we talked about 3 levels, I think, on the phone. One is the macro level there are 3 levels we can think about in how social emotional development, social emotional competence affects reading and other complex tasks. The first really is the macro level of a classroom or a home environment. And that we know that children who are in environments that feel safer or warmer, that are easier to take risks, are places where children will be more creative and they'll attend more, they're more likely to be successful. So the extent that a family creates a warm learning environment, a teacher makes a classroom like a warm family, children feel protected and safe that way, they're likely to take more chances. So that's at the macro level, I think, how we see social emotional processes affecting children's ability to face these challenges like reading. The second level is in the actual relationships, in that we know that teachers who have warm relationships but high expectations with children, we know that parents that have warm relationships but high expectations for children have children who are going to work more for them. And anyone who's seen a child work with 2 different teachers, the same child, or with 2 different tutors, it becomes obvious that certain personal qualities of teachers or tutors or parents can draw out skills in children that appear they didn't have. And this is what Lev Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. That is, we're not just interested in a child's competencies, we're interested in an environment that surrounds them, that brings them to the next level. That there's a zone of development they're just about ready to reach. And if they're in an environment with a teacher, a mentor, a parent, a tutor who is able to develop a relationship with them, understands how they behave and they think, they're much more able to draw them to the next level. And that's what's good learning or mentoring is about. It doesn't happen in a context in which there isn't a sense of trust and relationship. So like all aspects of cognition, they're somehow surrounded by emotion and relationship. We are human beings, and human beings are cultural beings. We do almost nothing in our world alone as children or as adults. And thus, almost all of our activities are affected either positively or negatively by the other people that we're around. It's the way we work. Now, a third part of that now is the direct relationship. Now let's go inside the child's brain and their heartbeat, etc. And now think about emotion processing. And that is when children are reading or trying to pay attention to something, the emotions that are coursing through their body, the physiological reactions they're having that are related to those, are impacting their ability to pay attention and recruit their cognitive skills. The more they feel upset, they feel anxious, they feel distracted, the more likely that the emotion centers of the brain are affecting their abilities to think. So that children, as they become more and more upset, are just like adults. When you become very upset, you make very bad decisions, and so do I. And it's not too different for children. The more they feel angry, sad, even excited, the less likely they are to think clearly, the less likely they are to be able to attend to the task. And when you have a complex task like reading, the less likely they are to be effective. Now that's the first part of that internal aspect, and that is just the level of emotional arousal that people have is going to affect their ability to attend and to learn. But then when you get into a task like reading, which is difficult and often frustrating for children, especially early in the process, when they begin to feel disappointed, angry, bored, they lose that sense of curiosity and interest in the task. They begin to say things to themselves like, this is no fun, I'm no good at this, my mom thinks I can't do it. And then the cognitive attributions begin to come in. And when children start to feel, I'm no good at this, then their emotional interest in the task begins to decline rapidly. Then their attention wanders, and then you see another level of problem with the task. It's not just their emotional arousal, because we're all varying in emotional arousal all day, but now we have the cognitive attributions that this task is too hard, I'm never going to be good at it. And when those attributions kick in, now we have another level of emotion regulation difficulty. And the more that happens, especially in classroom contexts in which children of all levels of processing are trying to manage the same tasks with one teacher, this is where children start to get turned off to reading and learning processes.
That's beautiful. I really appreciate the 3-point overlay. Sure. You did really wonderful. Thank you. Relative to this last point, I'd like to see if we can take it another step, which is that, and I'll try to ask it more in the form of a question. Having to do with, reading requires an enormous amount of cognitive bandwidth. One of the things that's now clear is that the more that somebody's occupied with kind of lower level code processing, the less bandwidth they have for reflective comprehensional processing. Mm-hmm. To the extent that statement's true, and there's growing evidence, is kind of supporting that, then, or the eye movement studies that have come in, suggesting that the moment somebody starts becoming self-reflective about what they're doing, it's eating up brain processing bandwidth that's diminishing what's available to do the task they are now talking to themselves about not doing well. So in addition to the emotional consequence of the emotion, mm-hmm. There's actually a cognitive consequence in terms of diminished capacity because the emotions are happening at all. That's rather right. Than the transparent entrainment that's necessary to get off the ground with this.
Yeah, okay, let me think about how to respond.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little tricky space, but
I had to self-reflect on this one.
Yeah.
When young children are learning a complex task like reading, the cognitive complexity of the task itself is quite. The cognitive complexity of the task itself requires almost all their bandwidth or attentional abilities. So, for example, the ability to process what the text is, to see the letter and recognize it, to be able to translate that into a sound, to understand that sound is part of other sounds that are going to form words, that those words are embedded in sentences. These are all complex cognitive and attentive tasks for children. If they are distracted by the feeling that they cannot do the task well, if they're saying to themselves at the same time, I'm not good at this, I don't like this, this is not fun, other children do this better than I do, I'm never going to learn it. All that talk and that emotional arousal is taking up what people call M space or cognitive space in the task. And when that happens, those distractions diminish the child's ability to actually do the task that they're now struggling with. Okay. Robbie Case, I don't know if you know Robbie Case. He was a sort of a post-Piagetian. He's up in Ontario. I think he might have passed away. I'm not sure. But he talked about M space. He tried to translate Piagetian's stages into a process. More like a distributed system information processing model. Way back in the late 60s, early 70s. And he talked about M space, which I fell into there.
That meme has gotten to me, although I don't know the source.
And basically he said what you see is you're growing M space. And part of what Piaget talked about as stage models is in fact, maybe some of it may be actually a qualitative stage. There's lots of argument about this. But a lot of it may be quantitative carrying capacity, if you will, which you call bandwidth.
Yeah, just the capacity to do this many the tasks that are involved. One of the things that's really interesting to us and part of the case that we're trying to make, I'll just do this kind of as a quick parenthetical thing, mm-hmm. and then we'll close, we're going over whatever's left for you, is that all this is happening in relation to this really unnatural form of confusion engendered by this technology. We're talking about the brain developing a language simulation module, something that can take instructions and information from an external code, mm-hmm. and generate an internal experience of language that we can then reflect on and comprehend. And that there is the average time we're talking about is in the 25 milliseconds per letter sound.
Mm-hmm.
Incredibly fast. And so there's this relationship between letters and sounds, which, unlike the history of this process where they're, for the most part, for the first 1,000 years, letters and sounds were equal, phonetically compatible.
Mm-hmm.
There's 1,100 ways we spell 44 sounds with 26 letters due to a series of just bizarre historical mistakes and accidents having nothing to do with any intelligent design on the part of humans or others. And this engenders this kind of cognitive confusion that children are wrestling with when they're 4 and 5 years old. The degree of their challenge, the degree of which their experience of the difficulty of this is connected to the trajectories that we've been talking about prior to all this. It's not really so much them, in terms of some innate neurobiological difference. It's more trajectory. And yet the context that we've set as parents, as a society, as schools, leads children who struggle with this to feel as if there's something wrong with themselves, as if the struggle is a reflection of something wrong with them.
Right.
And what's interesting to me and us and how we're working this is that, so what we're talking about is a form of confusion engendered by an archaic, neglected technology, causing millions and millions of our children to grow up feeling ashamed of their mental functioning. It just seems insane.
Yeah. Well, one of the problems with the nature of schooling now, and if I can speak specifically to the current schooling issues, is we have the enormous attention to test scores, especially reading test scores when children are young. And what has been called the No Child Left Behind Act, we can better refer to as the Whole Child Left Behind Act. Because what we're really interested in education, it's why people go into education. People don't become educators to teach children to read or do physics experiments. They become educators because they believe that they have a gift in helping children learn. And learning is the issue here rather than the outcome. We have to understand that children learn in a variety of ways and at a variety of speeds. We know that there are developmental individual differences in when children learn, and we've just been discussing how social emotional environments, genetic capacities, all kinds of factors are going to influence each child. Each child is not going to learn in the same way at the same time. And yet we have the complex situation of a teacher in front of a classroom of 20 to 30 children, all trying to move them forward at a relatively normal pace. This will work well for some children. There's no question that in education in general, at least half the children seem to do fine in group instruction, independent of individual differences in their abilities. But for the children that are not able to do it that way, classroom learning can become a very frustrating situation. And once the frustration sets in and children believe that they're not able to do the skills that are necessary, we start to see the trajectory towards both behavior problems and the trajectory towards school dropout. Okay? In American public schools in urban areas, we have a dropout rate between 40 and 50%. 40 and 50% of children are not doing what's necessary to learn the skills. Let me restate that. Teachers and classrooms are not creating the context for children to learn what's necessary, to have the skills to feel they're successful. And when they don't feel successful, they feel a sense of hopelessness that schooling will not help them become effective adults. And when that happens, we see the trajectory towards even poorer learning and towards dropout. I was at a meeting yesterday in Washington in which it was announced that only about 35% of 8th graders read proficiently in American schools. And so the nature of the problem is this is not a small problem. It's not a problem of learning disabilities. We're not talking about 7% of children that we believe have neurological damage that actually makes it difficult for certain circuits in the brain to work so that sound and visual schemes become linked to each other. We're talking about children that have relatively normal development, but we're failing to educate them in a way that helps them learn how to read, how to do other things that are necessary to become educationally successful. So we have to think about the problem a little differently. We have to think about the fact that we have to truly respect these individual differences. But it also means we need more individual instruction. That many children are not going to learn these skills well and feel bonded and committed to school unless we educate them in ways in which they learn successfully. And for many children, they will not learn successfully only by being in a large classroom with children that vary dramatically in their abilities, with one teacher trying to lead them forward. So the extent that we identify children early who are not making it in our system in the standard way, and help them before they begin to feel that they're failing, by giving them that one-on-one process, by highly trained people who are able to build warm relationships and technically take them through the steps of what's necessary for the reading process, the math process. That's what's necessary in order to make sure that we ensure success. Now, another part of this Okay. I thought I'd talk a little bit about books. There's a connection we had on the phone we talked about, and I know you can't stay longer, and I have to probably get done by 10:30, but
that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Before we leave this area, I want to be explicit and try to tie into another body of work that we're assembling here, which has to do with developing an emotional aversion to the feel of confusion. Right?
Mm-hmm.
What happens to a child that, due to repeated frustration and a sense of hopelessness, like you're describing with respect to breaking through this task, what happens to them is that when they start to develop just like reading itself is this automatic, faster than conscious assembly process. A lot of our emotions are happening automatic in terms of their effect on cognitive processes. What happens when a child starts to develop a self-protective, faster than they're even aware of, emotional aversion to going into certain things that cause them confusion? What does it do to their learning? And isn't that when you say 65% of 8th graders are below proficiency in reading, it seems to me they're in danger of what I just described.
Right.
And that's what makes reading so important to me.
Yeah. Are we on?
We're going.
Okay, good. Okay. When children are not able to meet the challenges of the complex processes of reading or of early math, not only do they begin to say things to themselves like I'm no good, or I can't do this, which inhibits their ability to maintain attention and actually recruit their cognitive processes. But over time, they begin to develop an aversion to certain contexts and to sitting down and actually looking at books. Even before they sit down, they're already feeling upset, a sense of failure, maybe confusion, low frustration tolerance, and therefore we get them to the point where they don't actually even enjoy engaging in the process. It's not just that they're maybe feeling confused when they actually don't know the difference between an F and an R, but they're actually feeling it even before they enter the process of even trying to process the information. And so for many children, we see another level over time developing. Not that they just show anxiety or confusion or frustration in the task itself, but now they show it in approaching the task. And this really becomes bad because at that point children are not learning to learn anymore. And the goal of education is not content. Content's going to continually change in this rapidly changing technological world. The issue is learning to learn and enjoying the learning process itself. And when children no longer enjoy the learning process, this is the real deficiency in our education. This is what we need to have. We're a society in which learning to learn is a constant all the way till we die. Imagine what it's like now for someone on Medicaid trying to figure out their drug prescription bill. It's a learning to learn process. Right. Now, there's a fundamental research question here that has not been well studied yet. But given the new technology we have in understanding the brain, both fMRI and PET scan, but even more important techniques like high-density ERP, the ability to now watch children and understand what these cognitive and emotional processes are in the second-to-second process of reading is something that's had very little investigation. And we're going to learn a lot more, I believe, in the next 10 years as we apply these techniques, not putting children who are asleep and looking at their brain imaging, not just watching what part of the brain lights up when they're reading, but understanding the psychophysiology and the brain mapping together. So we understand how emotion and cognition are operating together in the reading process is going to be very important.
Yeah, that's the thing I'm really most interested in. By the way, you see that new Mind issue of Scientific American? Christoph Koch from Caltech. Yeah. I interviewed him last week in Zurich. We talked all about this. And he says, look, we are off the scale away from having scanning technology with sufficient resolution to peer into the time precarious processes that we're talking about here.
These are momentary processes.
Yeah, see, when you put math and reading together, I mean, at one level, they both have emotional aversions working against them, downward spiral emotional aversions working against them. But math is something you can volitionally attend to. Reading is a construction that has to happen much faster than you can intentionally attend to, right? And spelling is something you can intentionally attend to.
Sure.
So they're all code processes, but reading requires an assembly module that's functioning in an entirely different way than the other two. Yeah. And that's what, that's where that confusion's hitting, and that's where we're talking something that by the time they pay attention to it, they're in trouble.
Yeah, exactly.
Unlike trying to work out a math problem.
Yeah, that's right. You can repeat it to yourself.
Yeah.
That's a different process.
Do that with reading.
Yeah. Right.
All right, so let's close up on the book point that I asked you to hold on.
Okay, so let's think about this a minute. An important part of reading is hearing language and rich language, and an important part of hearing rich language in our culture is being read to. Almost all books that children that we read to children are about characters that have emotions that are going up and down and all around. We as adults escape into novels, and the reason why we escape into novels is we're able to vicariously live the emotional lives of others. That's what makes makes fiction so exciting to both children and adults. Children who are read to regularly and who have adults, teachers, and parents who discuss the text of those, learn the richness of books. And this learning of the richness of books is very important early to helping children wanting to approach text and feeling that even though it's a struggle to learn this, there's something rich in there. There's a vein in there that they want to strike. When we do social-emotional curriculums in the classroom, it's very important that we tie these together. We don't think about the social-emotional development of a child and that curriculum, and then we think about the language and reading and that being a separate curriculum. The goal here is to tie it all together and make a really rich curriculum in which children don't know if they're learning to read or learning to know about themselves and others. There's just a process of learning occurring. And so we spend a lot of time in our social-emotional work linking it to literacy. Trying to make those bridges very clear so that we pick books for children that are both good books from a vocabulary standpoint, if you will. They have the right words in them given the children's developmental needs, but that engage the children in the process of thinking about both the characters and themselves. And one of the effects we found in the past curriculum with deaf children is that we have a significant improvement in reading achievement in children who had the PATS curriculum compared to random samples of children that did not receive it. And this is in third and fourth grade reading achievement. When I went back to the teachers and I asked them why they felt that the reading achievement improved in the kids that had PAS, they gave me two reasons. One is they said because children were less disruptive in the classroom and they were able to settle themselves down, there was more on-task time. And we know that to some extent on-task time is related to achievement. The second thing they said is because the children now understood much more about emotions, about jealousy and pride and anger and frustration and joy and wonder, they were able to talk. They were more interested in the text. They were more interested in stories, and they had much richer discussions after the stories. And they felt that got them more engaged in reading, and that led to their improved reading achievement. Now, I actually don't think either one of those probably is what caused the change in the reading achievement test. But I do think they're probably very important for children learning to read, being on task more time in the classroom and being richly involved in character development. I think the reason they did better on the achievement test is because achievement tests in American schools are multiple choice tests. And most children that are impulsive don't even probably read the entire question before they answer. So they've got the A, B, C, and D, and they impulsively tend to pick the first one they see that might be a good answer. I think what happened is, because we're teaching children to plan ahead, that they actually read all 4 answers before they made a choice, and therefore the probability of scoring higher on the test was better. Now, is that an important skill? Yes, it's a very important skill, because what we're teaching children is to plan ahead and think before they act. And that's true. It's an important part of the reading process, but it's important for a much larger process than reading, because all action requires us to think before we act. So it may be that the results were the result of on-task time. It might be the result of more interest in text, and it might be the result of the fact that we have a more master skill here, a skill of emotional and social competence, which is thinking before acting, which affects on-task time, and it affects reading in general. And that's the point here, is that these things are linked together. We have one mind and one brain. Emotion and cognition are processing all the time. And the extent that we integrate them in the learning process, the more likely we are to be successful in making children who are more emotionally competent, but also more cognitively and academically competent. Okay, good.
Great place to land.
Good.
Thank you.
Sure, sure. So have you tried Chomsky?
I had a brief interchange.
I'm interested in what he would say.